Welcome to another of the Centre for Economic Policy Research's video podcasts on the fast-moving impact of COVID-19. My name is Tim Phillips. The international market mechanisms that we've constructed over the last 3 decades to deliver economic growth have failed in many ways during this crisis to deliver the job security, medical equipment, and sometimes even food that we need. It's also presented us with a daily news agenda of incoherent policy and market failure. So do we need a new design for our economic systems to deal with future black swans? This is the theme of a paper called Economic Resilience, Globalization and Market Governance, Facing the COVID-19 Test. And it's written by Frédéric Jenny of ESSEC Business School. He's also chair of the OECD Competition Committee. He wrote it for issue 1 of COVID Economics, the new journal from the CEPR. And Frédéric joins me today. Hello, Frédéric.
Hello, how are you?
Okay, thank you very much, and I hope you're well. Now, your paper raises some important questions about how our economic and political systems run and for what purpose. And the crisis has highlighted these, but surely these questions were always there in the background, but before we just had the luxury of not having to think about them too hard.
A lot of those questions were already discussed, but indeed the crisis and the shock to the global economy and or system of decision making has made it much more important to think about those issues.
And the first question you raise in the paper, a very important one, something we're seeing all the time at the moment, is what is the role of experts? Now, in this case, we're hearing a lot about medical experts, but this raises larger questions of professional expertise and the role that that has in policy making against democratic legitimacy, I suppose.
Yes, what's been interesting in this crisis is the fact that, first of all, we realize that politicians are not always entirely credible, and therefore they want to back up what their decisions are by scientific advice, either commissions or scientific people who are responsible for part of the administration. This raises interesting questions. Because the role of politics is to go beyond science or to adjudicate the trade-offs when there are trade-offs. And in this crisis, we have 2 issues. One of them is that science is not going as fast as we would hope for, so that scientists don't always have the answers. So that's one. And second, there are political trade-offs that have to be taken into consideration. So when politicians rely on scientists, sometimes they push scientists to make decisions or to suggest decisions which go beyond what those scientists can actually say. And we can see this tension both in the US and in Europe in many of the decisions which have been made.
We're also discussing at the moment that tension into how much surveillance and intrusion in our privacy is justified. We're hearing about it at the moment on whether or not everyone should have these track and trace apps on their smartphones. And that's in the interest of saving lives, but there are clear cultural differences between how different countries, different societies approach this question, aren't there?
Yes, I mean, there was a debate already, but the debate before the crisis was more on the side of how can we protect our data, how can we make sure that other governments in some countries or firms in other countries don't get access to our private lives. Now, with the crisis, what has been very clear is that if you think about confinement, for example, if you want to make sure that the confinement is effective, it can be extremely useful if some of the locational information that's on your smartphone is transmitted to authorities so that they can check that the confinement is effective. So all of a sudden, the logic of protection of privacy is changed because we see that the exchange of data can have a positive global benefit to society. So we have to think more, maybe more subtly about the trade-offs there than we did before the crisis.
Now, there's another value judgment, another guardrail around policy, if you like, that's always been present in public policy, particularly in Europe, and that's the precautionary principle. And that's one of those phrases that a lot of people hear about, but we don't really have to think about what it means in practice. How does it enter this argument? Why is it so relevant at the moment?
Well, it's the precautionary principle is based on how should you make take decisions in when there is both a possible irreversibility of your decision, and second, uncertainty about what it is that you're supposed to decide on. So this is something which has been with us for a long time. If you think about the ban against hormone beef, for example, it is based on the precautionary principle. There may be irreversible harm, but we are not quite sure. In that case, I want to be on the safe side, and I decide to ban it. Some people have argued that this way to approach the decision-making is not only unscientific, but maybe, in fact, distract from more research and therefore has a cost to society. Now, in this crisis, I mean, we've seen that science doesn't give us all the result on what would be, for example, medicines that could work. And we've got some experiments which are not scientifically validated, but seem to go into a direction. Question is whether we don't have to wait for the scientific result. What should we do in the meanwhile? Let people die, or just try those medicines which are not fully guaranteed from the scientific point of view? So this dilemma and the use of the precautionary principle, particularly in a case of an epidemic where thousands and thousands of people may die, seems to be something that is quite appealing, in fact.
Now, we have this particularly for the epidemic at the moment, but these things that we've talked about so far, they're very much about how much information do we need before we act. Is this a unique situation that we're in now, or do you think that we have more situations in which these decisions will become, or have already been, very relevant, and we might be able to have a new sort of settlement on evidence against policy?
Well, I think that what the crisis has shown is that black swan events can happen. And I think that the common logic of the black swan events, the unexpected events which are massive and disrupt the economy, is that when they happen, we are going to have a deficit of information on how to react, because we had not anticipated them, or maybe because they couldn't be anticipated. So whether it's a massive earthquake or whether it's a massive pandemic, we have those. Now, so what we have to develop a strategy to think about, okay, how should we react when we have a black swan event? How should we provide for the possibility that such events may happen? I think that recently we haven't been worried about this. We've been relying on markets to react. If there's a need for something, somehow we'll find it on the market. But what we've learned is that markets react rather slowly in a case of stress, and that therefore anticipating possible needs, maybe putting money in stocks that maybe will not be useful, but could be useful in this black swan, could be something to think about.
Now, there's another trade-off here that we don't really want to think about, but it's always present at the moment. And some people have voiced it, which is, how many lives are we prepared to sacrifice to protect the functioning of the economy? This hasn't been made explicit in many political arenas. However, in the United States, then that has been under discussion. Is the trade-off really that brutal?
First of all, I think it is that brutal. And I think that, in fact, when you think about health policy, even in the past, to what extent you make available and at what cost do you make available some treatment for a very small number of people who are risking their lives when those treatments are extremely costly. That's something that was even if no one talked about, it was something which was in the back of the mind of public policymakers. In this particular case, where we have a possible conflict between confinement, which is effective but very costly, and lives, the trade-off is clear. And when you read what's happening in the US, but also what's happening in many European countries, you see that governments are torn in between the cost of confinement that will save lives but at a very high cost, and the desire to kickstart the economy, even running some risks to lives if you start too early. So this is something that we cannot escape as a dilemma.
Is there a way to possibly explain this dilemma better to the public? Because I sense that one of the reasons why it isn't really talked about very much is it excites very strong reactions.
I think that the difficulty with the public is the fact that, of course, we firmly believe that individual lives do not have a price. I mean, I want to save someone in my family, among my friends, no matter what the cost is. But this is not feasible at the public policy level. So we have to accept the idea that individual lives do not have a price, but collective lives have a cost to society, and that there is a trade-off. I think that at least in the public debate recently, I mean, people have been aware of the trade-off. They don't want to talk about it directly, but when you hear people who say, well, we have to start the economy again, it's not only politicians, it's also business people. And so we have to live with some amount of risk. So then the question is, how can I minimize the risk of this deconfinement to kickstart the economy? But there, I think that the trade-off between health, lives on the one side, and allowing the economic machine to work is present in the mind of people.
Now, also, globalization has come up and the limits to globalization. There have been opponents of globalization for many years, and they have argued that it makes home economies vulnerable to trading partners who they have no control over and who aren't accountable to their democratic or political processes. They're on the other side of the world. Now, the scramble that we've seen for medical equipment, medical devices, has seemed to be a demonstration of the lack of power that certainly small economies have in a globalized world. Do you think this signals a retreat from globalization in the future?
First of all, I think that the wisdom of globalization, not really the wisdom of globalization, but the way we have been globalizing was called into question by economists. I mean, Danny Roderick, for example, and many others have already mentioned the fact that maybe we mismanaged globalization in the past. So I think that the crisis is bringing this home in a very obvious way. We cannot rely on globalization in a time of intense stress, because first of all, other countries may be affected as much as we are, or even more than we are, and second, markets are going to react slowly. So that is not a call against globalization, but it's a call for caution when you think about globalization and what measures should be taken to try to alleviate some of the possible cost of globalization. So there, I think that what we're going to see, first of all, in the very short run, there's going to be clearly a tendency to retreat from globalization. And that's because in many countries, governments are going to have to use state aid to help kickstart the economy. And they don't want their aid to go to foreign countries. They want the aid of their own taxpayers to go to their companies. So there is going to be, just like there was in 2009, a tendency to have more or less protectionist policies. In the longer run, I think that the issue is not that we are not going to want globalization, because it's clear that there were incredible benefits to globalization, but what kind of industrial policy do we want to have with respect to globalization? And this is going to be particularly relevant to two issues. One of them is, what safety valves do we want to keep domestically? In other words, it's something which has been done in some areas. For example, if you think about oil, I mean, every country has strategic stocks, for example, that they keep just in case there's a time of crisis. But we haven't done this in the health sector, for example. Okay, so the issue is whether we should think in those terms in other sectors. Do we need to have stocks? Do we need to keep some capacity to produce locally in case there's a need to meet a very important demand? I think the second dimension is going to be okay, if we are going to rely on globalization, don't we want to diversify our sources of supply in order to try to minimize the risk that an accident in one particular country might, okay, have we been too over-reliant on supply from China? And should we have had a more diverse set of suppliers? Would have this been better? So I think that we're going to think, and this is going to call possibly for industrial policy, strategic thing, and maybe a longer term planning in thinking about the economy.
We are really being forced to confront the limits of that consensus that has emerged around a small government, market-driven economy at the moment. Do you think that we can find some consensus around the industrial policy governance structures that should replace it? We're used now to seeing these large intergovernmental conferences not achieving very much, and suddenly there's a huge policy agenda.
Yes, I mean, there are two issues in your question. The first one is, do I see that there is going to be a call for more government involvement in economic mechanisms that we have seen in the past? I think very clearly, yes. I think that there were already signs in that direction even before the crisis. But I think that for the reasons that which I've just mentioned, the fact that because our health has been on the line, there is clearly going to be a need for government to have more direct action, thinking, planning. It's not going back to a planned economy, but it's at least to have safety nets that are in place. The second one is, which you raise implicitly, is whether when one thinks about this government intervention, are there some possible interest in mutualizing it among a small set of countries, let's say at the European level? And it would be very interesting. To be honest, there's been very little development in this area over the last 20 years. But I think that it would make very much sense, either at the level of the whole of Europe or at the level of subsets of countries of Europe, to try to mutualize our efforts so that we can have some security, but at a lower cost than if we were entirely depending on our own reserves in each country, while at the same time benefiting from globalization. So that will require an industrial policy, I think, at least a cooperation on industrial policy, and possibly some common actions. And again, those common actions we've been able to take in some other fields. And if you think of the fields of defense, for example, there are groupings of countries that are acting together. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do it for economic defense.
Well, it's a huge policy agenda, and it's going to be fascinating to find out what happens. Thank you very much, Frédéric.
Thank you very much for having me. And as you said, I think that the crisis has revealed a number of trade-offs, and that one of the benefits of that shock, which is a terrible shock, is going to be that we're going to have to think about those trade-offs in a more deliberate and considerate way.
I am sure that we will, and it's going to be fascinating to find out what happens for that. Now, for all of you watching this, you can read more about this in Frédéric's paper. It's called Economic Resilience, Globalization and Market Governance, Facing the COVID-19 Test. That's correct. It's in issue 1 of COVID Economics. You can find that on voxeu.org. It's not hard to find in our special section of COVID-19 coverage, and it's a free download, of course. But also keep in touch with all the COVID-19 coverage at VoxEU. We're adding it to it every day with articles, podcasts, videos, webinars. And to all of you watching, please stay safe. And from the CEPR, goodbye for now.